Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Kyle Abbott's life had always been defined by the battles he fought between family loyalty, corporate wars, and the complicated matters of the heart, but nothing in his storied past could have prepared him for the heart-stopping moment when his phone rang that fateful afternoon, the name flashing across the screen in small but urgent letters, Harrison, his young son, calling from Summer's number, his little voice trembling on the other end of the line as he whispered words that sent a chill rushing through Kyle's veins like ice water, words that ripped him out of the boardroom mindset he had been buried in just minutes earlier and plunged him into a realm of pure panic, a father's worst nightmare unraveling in real time, because Harrison was not supposed to be calling him alone, not supposed to sound that terrified, not supposed to beg for help in that shaky tone that revealed the depth of danger circling him like unseen predators in the shadows, and Kyle's heart hammered wildly in his chest as he struggled to make sense of what his boy was saying, fragmented cries about Mommy Summer, locked doors, people arguing, a strange man in the background, and the unmistakable plea for rescue that pierced Kyle's ears and shattered every illusion of safety he thought he had built around his son, sending him sprinting out of Jabot headquarters without a second thought, leaving behind stunned employees, unanswered questions, and abandoned responsibilities, because nothing mattered anymore except getting to Harrison before something unthinkable happened, before this nightmare spiraled into tragedy, and Kyle's mind raced at 1,000 miles per hour as he jumped into his car, fumbling with the keys, replaying the snippets of Harrison's voice over and over again like an endless loop of torment that only fueled his desperation, whispering to himself in ragged breaths that he wouldn't let anything happen to his boy, not now, not ever, because this was more than just a call, it was a cry for salvation, and Kyle knew instinctively that Harrison's situation was tied to Summer's latest downward spiral, the battle she had been fighting silently but visibly, the cracks that had been forming in her composure, the emotional breakdown she tried to hide from him, and the dangerous path she had been walking, one that Kyle had worried might someday spill over and place Harrison directly in harm's way, and now, judging by the tone of his son's trembling voice, that dreaded moment had arrived, manifesting in real time, pulling Kyle into a storm where every second counted, every decision could mean the difference between life and death, and his fatherly instinct screamed louder than logic, urging him to push harder on the accelerator, to ignore the red lights, to weave recklessly through traffic, because Harrison needed him. Harrison had reached out with small, scared hands through a phone line, and Kyle would burn the world down if that was what it took to bring him safely back into his arms, back into the warmth of security, away from whatever chaos Summer had dragged them into, and as the road blurred beneath his tires, Kyle's thoughts grew darker, wilder, full of questions and accusations. What had Summer done? Who had she allowed near their child? Why hadn't she told him if she was in over her head? And was this the final proof that she could no longer be trusted to protect the most precious gift they shared? Because Kyle had spent months trying to balance compassion for Summer's struggles with the duty of protecting Harrison, but now there was no room left for compromise, no space for patience or tolerance, not when his little boy was in danger, and his heart clenched painfully as he remembered the exact sound of Harrison's voice, that frightened little plea, "Daddy, please come, I'm scared." Words that cut through Kyle's very soul and would haunt him forever if he failed to answer them in time, so he pressed harder on the gas, feeling adrenaline take full control, already preparing himself for the worst-case scenario he might find upon arrival, Summer unconscious, strangers in their home, Harrison hidden in a corner with wide tearful eyes, and Kyle swore to himself that nothing, absolutely nothing, would stop him from tearing down whatever stood between him and his son's safety, even if it meant confronting Summer in her darkest hour, even if it meant exposing secrets she'd tried to bury, because at the core of everything, Kyle Abbott was a father before he was anything else, and Harrison's call had awakened that primal protector within him, the one that would claw through fire and storm to rescue his child, the one that would never forgive Summer if she had indeed dragged their innocent boy into the dangerous wreckage of her spiraling life. And as he neared the house, his pulse pounding with a mix of dread and determination, Kyle whispered aloud a single promise to his son, to himself, and to the universe: "I'm coming, Harrison. Daddy's coming. Nothing will stop me." The tire screeched against the asphalt as Kyle swerved recklessly into the neighborhood, the familiar streets blurred by the haze of panic clouding his vision, his knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel, his mind torn between hope and fear, whispering silent prayers that Harrison was safe, that his son's tiny voice would not be silenced by the madness that seemed to be tightening its grip on Summer's fragile world. He barely remembered parking, if he had even parked at all, before leaping from the car, his heart jackhammering in his chest, his lungs straining for air as though they too were being crushed by the weight of his fear, and the world seemed to narrow into tunnel vision as his gaze landed on the house, the once comforting home now looming like a fortress of secrets, its windows dark, its doors shut tight, exuding an aura of suffocating tension that made the hair at the back of his neck stand on end. He bolted up the walkway, his feet pounding against the concrete, his voice breaking as he shouted Harrison's name, desperate for a response, desperate for even the faintest sound of his son's voice to cut through the suffocating silence, but none came, only the echo of his own panic bouncing back at him as he reached the front door and found it locked. Kyle's chest constricted as though the world itself was conspiring to keep him away, and in that split second, logic vanished, replaced by raw instinct, the protective surge of a father who would stop at nothing, and with a fierce growl he slammed his shoulder against the door once, twice, until the frame splintered and the lock gave way, bursting open to reveal a scene that would be forever etched into his memory, a scene both horrifying and heartbreaking, one that confirmed every fear that had been clawing at his chest since Harrison's trembling phone call. Inside, the house was a wreck, the living room a battlefield of broken glass, overturned furniture, scattered toys lying abandoned in corners like casualties of a war that should never have reached a child's sanctuary. The air was heavy, thick with the acrid stench of alcohol mixed with something else, something metallic and foreboding that made Kyle's stomach churn, and there in the chaos stood Summer, wild-eyed and unsteady, her hair disheveled, her hands trembling as though she had been fighting ghosts no one else could see, her lips moving soundlessly before she finally turned her gaze toward him, her eyes glazed over, drowning in a mixture of shame, fear, and defiance. "Kyle," she breathed, her voice hoarse and broken, but he didn't stop to hear the rest because his attention was already scanning the room, desperately searching for Harrison, every fiber of his being demanding proof that his son was alive and unharmed. "Where is he?" Kyle barked, his tone sharper than he had ever used with her, his desperation cracking through every syllable. "Where's Harrison?" Summer's lips quivered, her hand lifted as though to point, but the words tangled in her throat, and before she could answer, Kyle heard it, a faint sob, muffled and distant, the kind that ripped straight through his chest, guiding him like a beacon, pulling him down the hallway toward the bedroom door that was barely cracked open. He shoved it wide, and there, huddled in the corner, clutching his stuffed dinosaur like a lifeline, was Harrison, his little face streaked with tears, his eyes wide with terror as they met his father's. Kyle dropped to his knees instantly, his arms outstretched, his voice softening in an instant despite the storm raging inside him. "It's okay, buddy. Daddy's here. I've got you." Harrison bolted into his arms, his tiny frame shaking violently as Kyle pulled him close, wrapping him in the strongest embrace he could muster, swearing silently that he would never let go, never let anything like this happen again. The child buried his face into Kyle's chest, whispering brokenly, "I was so scared, Daddy. Mommy was yelling, and then a man came, and I didn't know what to do." Kyle's blood ran cold at the mention of the man, his jaw tightening, his fury burning hotter than ever, but he forced his tone to remain calm for his son's sake, smoothing Harrison's hair, rocking him gently as though to shield him from the world. "You're safe now. I promise. Daddy's here. Nothing's going to hurt you." But even as he spoke those words, his eyes flickered back toward the living room where Summer stood like a fragile statue on the verge of shattering completely, and the unanswered question of who that man was, and what he had wanted, gnawed at Kyle's mind like a relentless predator. He carried Harrison out into the living room, keeping him pressed firmly against his chest, his protective instincts roaring as he positioned himself between his son and Summer, his voice low and seething with fury. "What the hell happened here, Summer? Who was in this house with our son?" Summer flinched at the venom in his tone, tears brimming in her eyes as she tried to form an answer, but the words slipped and faltered, her guilt as visible as the broken glass at her feet. Kyle, I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought I could handle it. He just showed up, and I couldn't stop him." Her voice cracked, and she collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as sobs shook her shoulders. But Kyle had no sympathy left, not when Harrison had been forced to pick up a phone and call him in terror, not when the boy had been forced to witness chaos that could scar him forever. "You put him in danger," Kyle snapped, his voice trembling with restrained rage. "You let someone into this house, and our son had to beg me to save him. Do you have any idea what that did to him? What it did to me?" Summer looked up then, her face streaked with tears, desperation in her eyes as she reached toward him. "I didn't want him to see any of this. I swear, Kyle, I never wanted Harrison to get hurt. I've been drowning, and I thought maybe this man could help, but it all spiraled out of control." Kyle recoiled from her touch, clutching Harrison tighter, his decision solidifying in that instant. "No more excuses, Summer. I don't care what you're going through. Harrison comes first. From now on, he stays with me. I'm not risking his life because you can't control who you let into this house." The words cut deep, and Summer gasped as though he had struck her, her body folding in on itself with the weight of his ultimatum, but Kyle didn't waver. He couldn't. The image of Harrison huddled in that corner, terrified and trembling, was seared into his soul, and nothing Summer could say would erase that. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Kyle stood guard, his mind racing through the implications, the legal battles that might follow, the emotional fallout for Harrison, the heartbreak of watching Summer crumble before his eyes, but none of it mattered compared to the singular mission of keeping his son safe. He turned toward the door, his voice firm and final. "We're leaving." Summer's sobs grew louder, her pleas desperate, but Kyle ignored them, carrying Harrison out into the cool evening air, away from the wreckage, away from the danger, away from the broken promises. He strapped his son into the back seat, whispering gentle reassurances, his hands trembling as he brushed the boy's hair back from his tear-streaked face. "It's over now. I've got you. Nothing's going to hurt you, not as long as I'm here." Harrison clung to his father's hand, his small fingers gripping tightly as though he feared letting go would plunge him back into the nightmare, and Kyle vowed silently that he would never let that happen. As he drove away, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, Kyle's thoughts turned dark and heavy, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. He knew this was far from over. Summer's demons were not going to disappear overnight, and the mysterious man Harrison had mentioned was a loose thread that could unravel into something far more dangerous. But for now, as the city lights flickered in the distance and his son slowly drifted into an exhausted sleep in the back seat, Kyle allowed himself a fleeting moment of relief. He had answered Harrison's call. He had rescued his boy. And though the battle ahead would be long and brutal, filled with legal fights, emotional wounds, and perhaps even threats from whoever had invaded their lives, Kyle knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would fight until his last breath to keep Harrison safe, no matter what it cost, no matter who he had to face, because nothing in this world mattered more than being the father his son could always call upon, the protector who would always come, no matter how dark the night. The ride home should have been quiet, a moment of fragile peace after chaos, but Kyle's mind was anything but calm. The hum of the engine was drowned out by the echoes of Harrison's sobs, the sound replaying in his head like a cruel soundtrack. Every glance at his son in the rearview mirror tightened the knot in his chest. Harrison's small frame curled against the car seat, his little hand still gripping the stuffed dinosaur as though it were the only anchor in a world that had suddenly turned frightening and unpredictable. Kyle's heart broke anew every time he saw those wide, exhausted eyes blinking heavily, trying and failing to fight off sleep, the remnants of fear still etched across his innocent face. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Childhood was supposed to be filled with joy and laughter, not terror and tears. As Kyle pulled into the Abbott Mansion driveway, the looming house felt both like a safe haven and a battlefield waiting to host the next war. He carried Harrison inside with the same protectiveness he had felt in that moment of rescue, whispering softly, "You're home now, buddy. You're safe." The staff moved quietly, sensing the tension, but none dared ask questions. Jack was the first to emerge from the study, his brows furrowed the moment he saw Kyle carrying Harrison in his arms. "My God, what happened?" Jack asked, his voice taut with concern as he reached to steady his grandson. Kyle shook his head quickly. "Later, Dad. Harrison needs rest." Jack wisely didn't press further, instead helping Kyle tuck Harrison into bed. The boy clung to his father until sleep finally claimed him, the exhaustion pulling him under like a tide he couldn't fight. Kyle sat on the edge of the bed long after, brushing the boy's hair gently, memorizing every rise and fall of his chest, unwilling to leave until he was absolutely certain Harrison had slipped into a peaceful slumber. His mind, however, was far from peace. Rage simmered beneath the surface, directed at Summer, at himself for trusting her too much, and at the unknown man who had crossed into their world like a shadowy intruder. When Kyle finally left Harrison's room and closed the door softly, Jack was waiting in the hallway, his expression heavy with questions. Kyle didn't hold back. In a low, furious whisper, he recounted the frantic phone call, the broken door, the wreckage of the living room, and Harrison huddled in the corner like prey in hiding. Jack's face hardened with every detail, his jaw set in that familiar Abbott line that meant war was brewing. "She put our boy in danger," Jack said, his voice tight with both anger and sorrow. "Kyle, this isn't just about Summer needing help anymore. This is negligence. This is unforgivable." Kyle's throat constricted at the truth in his father's words. He had spent months making excuses for Summer, telling himself she just needed time, support, compassion. But compassion had limits, and the sight of Harrison trembling in fear had shattered every excuse into dust. "I'm done, Dad," Kyle said finally, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of finality. "I'm going for full custody. I can't trust her with him anymore." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, the kind of declaration that would change everything, and Jack nodded solemnly, knowing the war ahead would be brutal but necessary. But even as Kyle solidified his resolve, the mystery gnawed at him. Who was the man Harrison had seen? Summer had claimed he just showed up, but Kyle didn't believe it was that simple. He had seen the fear in Summer's eyes. It wasn't just about her guilt, it was about something bigger, something darker. Someone had forced their way into that house, someone who clearly had leverage over Summer. And that someone might not be done yet. The realization sent a cold shiver down Kyle's spine. Meanwhile, back at the wrecked house, Summer sat in the ruins of her living room, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands shaking as she poured another drink. Her world had collapsed in a single night. Kyle had taken Harrison, rightfully so, and she had no defense against his rage. But what haunted her more than Kyle's words was the memory of the man who had come storming back into her life. His voice echoed in her mind, deep, menacing, reminding her of debts she had tried desperately to bury. He hadn't come for her out of kindness. He hadn't come to help. He had come to collect, and now she had no son, no ally, no shield to protect her. By morning, Kyle's resolve had only strengthened. He called Michael Baldwin, his voice shaking with both fury and urgency as he explained the situation. "I want to start the custody process immediately," Kyle demanded. "Whatever it takes, Michael. Harrison stays with me. No visitation until Summer proves she's stable." Michael, ever the calm strategist, warned that it wouldn't be simple. Courts rarely stripped custody without a drawn-out fight, especially given Summer's standing as Harrison's mother. But Kyle was relentless. "I don't care how long it takes. I don't care how messy it gets. My son called me for help last night. He begged me to save him. That's all the proof I need." Word spread quickly through the Abbott family, and Diane wasted no time in inserting herself into the situation. She cornered Kyle in the kitchen, her voice dripping with vindication. "I told you Summer was spiraling, Kyle. I told you she wasn't fit to raise Harrison right now. But you never wanted to hear it from me." Kyle bristled at her tone but didn't argue, because for once, Diane wasn't wrong. He could see the satisfaction in her eyes, but beneath it was genuine concern. Diane loved Harrison in her own complicated way, and she, too, had been terrified of what Summer's instability might mean for the boy. But even as the Abbott fortress rallied around Kyle, questions lingered about the stranger who had invaded Summer's home. Kyle couldn't let it go. That detail could not be ignored, not if Harrison's safety was on the line. He pressed Summer for answers, showing up at her house later that week despite the restraining order of rage between them. She opened the door slowly, her face pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept in days. "What do you want, Kyle?" she croaked, her voice fragile. "I want the truth," he snapped, his eyes burning into hers. "Who was he? The man Harrison saw? Don't lie to me, Summer. Our son deserves better than half-truths." Summer's lip trembled as she shook her head, whispering, "You don't understand, Kyle. If I tell you, he'll come after both of us." The fear in her eyes was raw, bone-deep, and it rattled Kyle more than her drunken state had days earlier. This wasn't just about addiction or recklessness. This was about danger, real, tangible danger that had already invaded their son's life.